Okay, ready when you are.
Okay. As Liz just said, my name's Shaun, and I'm a full-time student at the moment, but previous to this last year, I spent 9 years doing emergency assistance in Whitmore Square at St Luke's Church. And in that time, we got to come across quite a number of people who were poor. So, it really asks the question about who are the poor? What do they look like? Have you ever met one? Do you know someone who's poor? And have you met a homeless person? Do you know what they look? Do you know one? The face of the poor comes in many different shapes, and the reasons behind it too, because you think that why are they poor? How do they get in that situation? We see everything. I've seen everything that came around from the typical homeless person to the Indigenous people, who most people associate with poverty, which is an extreme face, to victims of domestic violence, to just people the working poor, which is a new term that's coming up in our rhetoric. So what I thought was I'd sort of went and had a look and sort of define what poverty actually is. And it's a concept that's used to describe people in society that cannot afford the essentials that others take for granted. And while most Australians juggle payment of their bills, people living in poverty have difficult choices to talk about, whether skipping the next meal to pay for their textbooks. They miss out on opportunities and resources that others take for granted: adequate health, dental care, housing, education, employment opportunities, food and recreation. And one of the disturbing things that we just come up recently, that in South Australia, 1 in 6 people have difficulty in paying their electricity bill. And then you get to those that are actually living in houses without electricity. When they first introduced this, the poverty line, the New World Bank defined poverty as those that are on $1.25 a day, but that's gone up. We're now up to $2.50 a day. And that's absolute poverty, or extreme poverty, is conditions that are characterised by severe deprivation of basic human needs, including food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, health, shelter, education and information. It doesn't just depend on your income or your access to services. They looked at the number of people in Australia that in poverty has increased. We've gone from 11% of the population, and we're now up to around about 15% of the population that they look at on the poverty line. One of the most embarrassing, well, I think it should be embarrassing, cases of poverty in our community is amongst the Indigenous communities. And we see them, they've had the basic health card has been introduced because they've determined that these people weren't capable of making their own choices about how they spend their welfare money. It was deemed that these people wasted their money on alcohol and drugs. So we took that off them and we gave them this basic health card. And that was a very interesting concept, which did more harm than good. Indigenous communities were travelling 100 kilometres to Alice Springs. They were sitting in the sun, while the white people sat in their air-conditioned office until they designated it was time for them to get off their out in the sun, to come in to get a basic health card, to get some money, so they could go to Woolworths or Coles, no choice, and get the food that they needed. Then they'd hop on a bus, they'd travel back to their community. They would stop at the line before they went into their community to have their bags checked, because they weren't allowed to take alcohol into the community, and then they could get back on the bus and then they proceed. The basic health care card did what poverty really brings out: and that is it takes away your lack of choice. When you are on the poverty line, you start making choices about what you're going to spend your money on. How are you going to buy Christmas presents for the kids? What sort of food are you going to spend at Christmas? Are you going to have a Christmas? And where are you going to go at Christmas? Indigenous communities are referred to as the fourth world, and it's something that most people don't really associate that within Australia. They tend to think that Aboriginal communities are rampaged by alcohol and drugs. The truth is they've got basic lack of services, they're living in inadequate houses that are designed for them to fit into rather than to suit their needs, and lack of drinking water, which is one of their big things. No power, so there's not much good having a house just fitted out with electricity and taps and plumbing if you've got no water or electricity. One of the things we start looking at the effects of those that with vulnerable to poverty is that the life expectancy is a huge gap between life expectancy. You know, it's 11 and a half years for males, up to 7 years for females. Indigenous communities only have 65% the income that most other communities have. The unemployment rate is at 16%, while the rest of the community is 5%. And we start looking at the effects of the Indigenous community in our prison system, which is up to around about 40%. The other thing with that is that we're now starting to see generations of Aboriginal communities from the same family in prisons. Grandfather, father, mother, grandmother, mother and daughter. And that's in our prisons. And one of the statistics that came out of a prison forum recently was that children of prisoners, 1 in 7 is likely to end up in prison. So pretty well you've got a pathway. If you're an Aboriginal person in this country, you're likely to end up being unemployed. You're going to end up in jail or have some contact with the legal justice system. It's pretty hard to separate the cause of poverty from the effects, because while it's associated with various economic and social ills, population can be a cause of a side effect of poverty, but some of them can be removed by various measures. Eliminating the most complex underlying cases remains a challenge for both developing and developed nations. And some the cause of poverty include changing trends in the country's economy, lack of education, high divorce rate, which causes the feminisation of poverty, having a culture of poverty, overpopulation, epidemic diseases such as AIDS, malaria, and environmental problems such as lack of rainfall. One of the things that's just started coming out in the last 20 or so years is that term, the working poor. And you've probably heard or all heard of that. And that's really those people that are working, that by the time you pay off your rent, your electricity bill and all that, you've got no money left for anything else. And sometimes we're finding families where the husband and wife both work, just trying to maintain to keep their house a roof over their head. There's a lot of factors involved in that, and financial counselling does help with some of that, but most people are earning basically on the basic wage. So husband and wife working just really only just keeps the roof over their head. And the other thing is that is sometimes also full or part-time employment. These days, the idea of having a full-time job for the rest of your life is gone. We're now into the era of contracts and term employment. So a lot of people find that they get a contract, a 1 year, a 3 year contract if you're lucky, and the rest of the time it's part-time work. The older you get, the more that's likely to occur. I did touch on education and about the low-level education standards that are linked to unemployment and subsequently the risk of living in poverty, because families on low levels of income can't afford to educate their children to the acceptable Year 12 standard, and that increases chances of employment. Quite often you'll find families of long-term unemployment, the kids, that follows down. The children don't tend to complete school, their children don't complete school, and so the cycle continues on with, they end up living in, they don't get work, they end up living in housing trust houses, and along with the, well, I'd say the divorce rate, but also the amount of breakdown of family units with and relationships where some of these women in low socio-economic areas end up having 2 or 3 children with various different partners, and this starts creating problems of its own, and that cycle continues on, and we end up with the prison population. They get in contact with the legal justice system. The other things we look at are high costs of electricity. I mentioned earlier on that 1 in 6 can't afford to pay the electricity. That's just what's currently happening at the moment, and we haven't taken into account the people that've had their electricity cut off. One of the biggest problems with that come up when you're looking at financial counselling is the cost of electricity and water. You know, some of these people have horrendous bills. Obviously, you probably think about, turn off your electricity, close the doors, start being clever about how you use electricity. But if you haven't had anybody to show you how to use these skills, that doesn't help when you're suddenly confronted with a, $2,000 or $3,000 electricity bill. And some of these bills that come in are quite horrendous. They then get into the cycle where they're back to welfare agencies, getting emergency assistance. Now to that, you've got to go to financial counselling, and the cycle continues. You're on a merry-go-round. Housing is another issue with only a minority of people on low incomes own their own homes. Rents are increasing to unaffordable in most major cities. To try to find a suitably priced house to rent for someone on unemployment, you start looking at going out to the suburbs and out into the low-lying country areas. Once you're out into the country, that takes away your effects of employment. It also affects your transport costs, because to try to get from Murray Bridge to Adelaide to look for a job, when there's no jobs in Murray Bridge, you might find yourself going out further. But also affects with training and that. I looked at, over the past 2 decades, house prices have risen by 40%, while incomes have only risen by 12%. I think everybody knows that. Everything seems to go up, but my pay never doesn't go up, it still stays the same. Common problem with everybody. Health is another area where people are affected by poverty. Physical, mental illness, the high stress that is associated with living in poverty. To have to worry about how you're going to pay the bills, where you're going to find money to do this, to do that. Most of the people end up taking up smoking, poor diet. You start looking at what is dental care. Have you ever noticed that most people who are on very low income or have got some degree of poverty, you ever look at their teeth next time? Or maybe you won't look at their teeth because they're too embarrassed to look at you. But when you start looking at physical appearance, just your teeth, that affects everything that what you do, whether you're going to go out and face the world or whether you're going to even want to do anything. That's as exacerbated by poor diet, because if you don't know how to cook, you're not going to Hungry Jack's or McDonald's. Hardly a healthy diet. So health plays a huge increase in all this. Then we get down to, I did ask you to think about when was the last time you've seen a homeless person, or what do you think a homeless person looks like? You know, you've got the old typical stereotype, the bag lady or the bag man pushing their coal shopping trolley loaded up with baskets on either side, very stereotypical. But there are homeless people that look like you and me, probably more like you. They take pride in their appearance. They go to their different agencies. They clean themselves up because they've got pride and they don't want to let people think that they are homeless or unemployed. Others have gone past that. It doesn't matter anymore. Which brings me to the next thing, you know. Is the church, what is the church doing? Are they just anything much more than a Band-Aid merchant, you know? What are they really doing? Are they just putting Band-Aids on it all? When I thought about that, I went, it does appear like that. I know of very few churches around that actually deal hands-on with poverty. And then I thought, well, actually that's not really very fair. I think maybe we asked the question in a very provoking manner, because the reality is the churches have different welfare agencies doing their work for them, and they do this for a variety of legal and ethical reasons, because it needs to be done properly. You've got to have all the places in place. And when you start looking at each church, each denomination rather, has its own welfare branch. Anglican Church has Anglicare, Lutheran Church has Lutheran Community, Uniting Church has Uniting Care, the Catholics have Centrecare. So really the church is doing a little bit more than just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. In fact, I think Anglicare has been reported as being one of the largest welfare providers of welfare assistance in South Australia, and you know, and this is in every state. And yeah, and when you talk to people at different churches, you'll find that they are supporting the main welfare agency. Some churches actually go out and they provide hampers to. They've got a little box in their church, so they go out and they collect, and the people come in and drop off their whatever they can spare, and then whoever gets that box, they take it off to the welfare agency. So churches are providing more than just a Band-Aid. In fact, I think we'd be in serious trouble if the churches weren't doing as much as what they are doing now. But of course, they could always do more. And one of the things that we can do is support the welfare agencies of our particular denomination. They're always screaming out for help, they're screaming out for volunteers. There's an opportunity there. Where there's a call, there's an opportunity. But I went looking up and thought, what has God got to say about all this? Because at the end of it, that's one of the key issues. And I had a look at a couple of things. God's commands concerning the poor. And I had to get rid of all the Old Testament stuff because I tried to narrow it down a bit. But God's commands concerning the poor. In Luke, Proverbs says about, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. And from James, religion that our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after the orphans, widows in their distress, and keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Timothy said, command them to do good, to be rich in all good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. There was, next one was, why should we neglect